The ballroom of the Chicago Marriott Magnificent Mile suffocated under the weight of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and expensive pretense. Dom Perignon bubbled over the rims of crystal flutes. The air smelled thick, heavy with charred prime rib, dry champagne, and the suffocating musk of Tom Ford cologne. "Creed," Julian Ross called out. His voice cut through the soft clinking of silver forks. He raised his glass high. "Be honest with us. How does it feel being the guy who just comes along?" 40 high-ranking logistics executives went dead silent. Sitting beside my husband, I felt my spine turn to ice. Julian leaned forward. His silk tie caught the glare of the chandelier. "I mean, Mark is out here closing 7-figure shipping accounts for Hawthorne Logistics." Julian sneered. A cruel grin pulled at his mouth. "And what do you do all day, Elena? Check the mail? Count lettuce leaves at the grocery store?" A wave of ripples passed through the table. People snickered. Then came the sound that shattered my heart into jagged glass. Mark laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle. It was not a fake smile to smooth over an awkward joke. My husband of 9 years threw his head back and laughed loudly, freely, and genuinely. His shoulders shook against mine. I stared at him, the man I had cooked for, supported, and loved in the quiet dark of our home was laughing at my humiliation just to buy the approval of a room full of strangers. "Come on, man." Julian pressed, his eyes bright with cheap cruelty. "How does it feel to be the person everyone in this room is quietly embarrassed for?" My fork hit the porcelain plate with a sharp clack. I stood up. I did not rush. I buttoned my simple tailored blazer. I smoothed down my black dress. I did not look at Julian. I looked straight down the table at Titan Hawthorne, the 60-year-old CEO who sat in silence, enjoying the spectacle. "You have about 48 hours left to enjoy that seat, Titan." My voice rang out. It was low, steady, and sharp enough to split the room in half. "Because the woman you are all laughing at is about to sign your termination papers." The ballroom froze. A waiter dropped a silver tray in the corner. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. Mark's hand, which had been resting near my arm, pulled back as if he had touched a hot stove. Every eye in that gold-lit room locked onto me. I turned on my heel. My heels clicked hard, rhythmic, and unhurried against the polished marble floor as I walked out, leaving the laughter to die behind me. To understand how a quiet, certified public accountant ended up threatening a CEO under a downtown Chicago chandelier, you have to rewind 3 hours back to the quiet brownstone in Bronzeville, where the storm first began to gather. 3 hours earlier, the only sound in our bedroom was the faint hum of the radiator and the rustle of silk. I stood before the oval mirror, fastening a simple silver pendant around my neck. In the reflection, I watched Mark fidgeting with his cufflinks. Our marriage had grown quiet over the last few years, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of cold violence. Mark never yelled. He never raised his hand. Instead, he withdrew. When he felt insecure about his career, he built walls out of silence. He stopped asking about my day. He looked past me at the dinner table. He treated my job as a chief accountant for a regional organic grocery chain like an embarrassing hobby, a minor chore unworthy of real conversation. I bore that cold distance without a word. My father always told me on our porch on the south side, "Elena, build in the dark. Let the structure speak when it is ready." I lived by those words. I managed our household budget, paid off our debts, and kept our life running smoothly while Mark chased titles at Hawthorne Logistics. I was content to let him stand in the spotlight while I stayed near the doorway. "Are you almost ready?" Mark asked. He did not look at my face in the mirror. His eyes stayed fixed on his own reflection, straightening a velvet lapel. "Tonight is big, Elena." Julian invited Titan to our table. "Please try not to talk too much about store inventory or tax codes. Just try to fit in. His words carried the familiar, quiet sting I had endured for years. He was embarrassed by me. He assumed that because I did not brag over drinks, I had nothing to say. "I'll manage, Mark," I said softly. We drove up Lake Shore Drive in absolute silence. The dark waters of Lake Michigan crashed against the concrete barriers outside, throwing cold spray into the October air. Mark kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched, his mind miles away with his corporate ambitions. I looked out the window at the orange city lights reflecting off the water. I reached out and touched his forearm. He did not squeeze back. He did not turn his head. He just stared straight at the road ahead. Sitting in that cold passenger seat, I felt a deep ache in my chest. It was the quiet grief of a woman who realized she was carrying a marriage all by herself. I loved Mark, but I had spent 9 years letting him mistake my patience for emptiness. I had allowed him to believe I was nothing simply because I never felt the need to correct him. When we pulled up to the valet at the Marriott, the doorman opened my side of the car. The cold night air hit my face, crisp and smelling of lake water and exhaust. Mark stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and walked ahead toward the revolving glass doors without looking back to see if I was following. I paused on the sidewalk for a single second. I smoothed my blazer, took a deep, clean breath, and stepped through the glass doors into the golden heat of the lobby. I did not know it then, but the quiet doorway I had occupied for 9 years was about to collapse, and I was done standing in the shadows. The autumn wind howled against the stained glass windows of our Bronzeville brownstone. Inside, the clock on the mantel struck 2 in the morning. The quiet ticking sounded like a slow countdown in the dark house. I sat at the mahogany desk in my home office. A single brass lamp cast amber light over stacks of financial ledgers, tax filings, and legal folders. The room smelled of old paper, bitter black coffee, and the metallic tang of ink. 9 years of cold silence had built this room into my sanctuary. When Mark withdrew into his shell of quiet arrogance, I did not waste my nights weeping into a pillow. 6 months ago, I recognized the rot spreading through our marriage and his company. I refused to remain a passive victim of his cold treatment. While Mark slept, I studied. I crammed for the certified financial analyst exams until my eyes burned. I registered a private consulting firm, Vance Advisory LLC, structured quietly through Delaware. When Hawthorne Logistics hit a severe cash flow crisis 6 months ago, Titan Hawthorne scrambled for survival. He issued private convertible debt to stay afloat. Working through a private equity partner, I purchased 100% of those notes under my LLC. I held the legal right to convert that debt into an 85% controlling equity stake whenever the company breached its covenants. I had planned to present the debt restructuring as a gift for our 10th wedding anniversary to hand my husband a safety net. I opened my laptop. The blue glow illuminated the raw data of Hawthorne's accounting ledgers. My fingers moved across the keyboard. A forensic audit spreadsheet spread across the screen. Lines of red numbers highlighted systematic leaks. For 2 years, Julian Ross had been funneling shipping commissions into 3 shell corporations. The total theft stood at $600,000. My mouse hovered over archived emails. My chest tightened as I read Julian's messages to Mark. Julian had been feeding Mark fake memos. He convinced Mark to sign off on fraudulent invoices, turning my naive, prestige-hungry husband into a legal scapegoat. An email from 3 months ago caught my eye. Julian had written to Mark, "Your wife's grocery job is a drag on your image, man. An executive needs a partner who commands a room, not someone who counts coupons." Mark had replied, "I know. The heavy oak door of my study swung open with a sharp creak. Mark stood in the doorway. His hair was disheveled. His tux jacket was gone, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His eyes were bloodshot, smelling heavily of stale bourbon and cold sweat. "What are you doing up?" Mark demanded. His voice was raspy, laced with anger and lingering panic. "You embarrassed me tonight, Elena. You stood up in front of Titan and Julian and made a complete fool of yourself. What lies are you cooking up in here?" I did not flinch. "I am reviewing facts, Mark. Something you should have done months ago." Mark barged into the room. He slammed his palm onto the edge of my desk. "Julian told me everything weeks ago," Mark yelled, his breath hot and sour. "He told me you opened a secret bank account. $11,000. Elena, you've been hiding money from me. Were you planning to run away?" I looked at him. The lamplight showed the deep lines of paranoia on his face. I reached into a folder, pulled out a printed bank statement, and slid it across the desk. "Look at the statement, Mark," I said softly. Mark snatched the paper. His eyes scanned the transactions. His jaw slackened. The $11,000 had not been moved into an offshore personal account. Every dollar was tagged for a specific debt settlement account. 3 months ago, Mark had privately taken out a high-interest personal loan to cover his failed stock trades, a secret he had hidden from me under a pile of unpaid notices. I had discovered the notices in our shredder bin and set aside my personal savings to pay off his lender before his credit was destroyed. "You thought I was building an escape route," I whispered. "I was building a shield to keep you out of bankruptcy." Mark dropped the paper. His fingers trembled against the wood. He stared at the statement, then looked up at my computer screen. I turned the monitor toward him. The screen displayed Julian's embezzlement audit alongside the forged invoice approvals bearing Mark's signature. "Julian did not just mock me tonight, Mark," I said, pointing at the screen. "He has been stealing from Hawthorne for 2 years, and he used your vanity to make you sign the papers. You are sitting on a federal fraud charge." Mark went deathly pale. The bourbon flush vanished from his cheeks. He stumbled back a step, clutching the back of an armchair for balance. "No, Julian is my friend," Mark stammered, his voice shrinking into a squeak. "He said he was helping me get a promotion. He was setting you up to take the fall for $600,000. I replied. A sharp chime broke the heavy silence. My phone vibrated on the desk. A text message lit up the glass screen. It was from Deborah Marsh, the lead forensic auditor from my legal team. "Audit complete. Forensic evidence compiled. The federal SEC whistleblower package and board restructuring filings are ready for 9 a.m. Mark stared at the glowing screen, then at the evidence before him. Terror washed over his face. The cocky corporate executive was gone. In his place stood a broken man who realized his arrogance had blinded him to the snake at his table. I shut my laptop with a quiet, decisive click. The screen went dark. "Get some sleep, Mark," I said, rising from my chair. "Tomorrow at 9, the board meets, and the truth is going to speak." The executive boardroom on the top floor of Hawthorne Logistics smelled of burnt coffee, stale leather, and cold panic. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain streaks blurred the gray Chicago skyline. Inside, the hum of a jammed printer echoed down the hallway like a muffled machine gun. Titan Hawthorne sat at the head of the polished mahogany table. His silver hair was uncombed. Beside him, Julian Ross adjusted his gold cufflinks, his face wearing a cocky grin that masked a nervous twitch. Mark sat 3 chairs down, staring blankly at his cold coffee cup, his face drained of color. "Let's make this quick," Titan rasped, clearing his throat. "We are here to vote on Mark Miller's immediate termination to protect our reputation after last night's scene." The double doors swung open, slamming against the drywall with a sharp boom. I walked into the room in a tailored ivory blazer and black trousers. My heels struck the hardwood floor with crisp, deliberate thuds. Behind me walked Deborah Marsh, my lead attorney, carrying 2 thick leather briefcases, flanked by 2 forensic auditors. Julian scoffed, leaning back. "Elena, what is this circus? This is a private meeting. The supermarket aisle is 4 blocks down." I took the seat at the opposite end of the long table, right across from Titan. Deborah stepped forward, unzipped her briefcase, and slid a thick stack of blue-stamped legal documents across the polished wood. "My name is Deborah Marsh," my attorney announced, her voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "I represent Vance Advisory, LLC. 6 months ago, Vance Advisory purchased 100% of Hawthorne Logistics convertible debt notes. As of 8 o'clock this morning, due to covenant breaches regarding unauthorized liabilities, those notes have been converted." Deborah slammed a certified deed onto the center of the table. "Vance Advisory now holds an 85% controlling equity stake in this corporation. Mrs. Elena Vance is the sole managing partner. She holds absolute voting authority." The room went dead silent. Titan's jaw dropped. The color drained from Julian's face so fast he looked like a corpse in a tailored suit. Mark jerked his head up, staring at me in total speech-bound shock. "This is ridiculous." Julian spat, slamming his fist on the table. The water glasses rattled. "She's a glorified clerk." "Quiet, Julian," I said. My voice was low, smooth, and colder than the rain outside. I nodded to Deborah. She opened a second briefcase and distributed thick, red-bound audit binders to every board member. "Let us discuss real numbers," I said, leaning forward, resting my hands flat on the mahogany. "For 2 years, Julian Ross has operated 3 shell companies registered in Wyoming. Through forged procurement invoices, he has funneled $600,000 in shipping margins into his private accounts." I turned my eyes to Julian. He flinched under my gaze. "Every wire transfer bears your signature, Julian," I continued. "And every approval bears the forged signature of my husband, Mark Miller, whom you systematically set up to take the criminal fall for your theft." "Lies. All lies," Julian shrieked. Sweat beaded along his hairline, dripping into his stiff collar. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers. The boardroom doors opened a second time. 2 men in dark suits and silver tie clips walked in. Badges glinted on their belts beside holster straps. The air grew heavy with the sharp smell of rain-soaked wool and iron. "Julian Ross," the lead agent asked. His voice was flat. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest for federal wire fraud and embezzlement." Julian scrambled backward. His leather armchair flipped over, crashing onto the carpet with a heavy thud. "Titan, help me. Mark, tell them." Nobody moved. The federal agents stepped forward, grabbed Julian's arms, and pulled them behind his back. The sharp click-clack of steel handcuffs echoed through the silent room, like a whip crack. Julian sobbed, his face twisting in ugly panic as the agents dragged his feet across the carpet. His expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly as he was hauled out the door, his pathetic pleas fading down the long corridor. I turned my gaze back to Titan Hawthorne. The old man was shaking, his liver-spotted hands trembling on the table. "Titan," I said softly, "you ignored internal procurement red flags for 18 months because you were too lazy to check the ledgers. You let a thief run rampant under your roof. Effective immediately, the board accepts your termination as chief executive officer without severance." Titan bowed his head. He did not say a word. He stood up slowly, picked up his leather notebook, and walked out the door with his head hanging low. I stood up from my chair and looked down the long table at the remaining board members. I am nominating Asha Moore as interim CEO, I announced clearly. A murmur ran through the room. Asha, a 32-year-old logistics supervisor sitting at the back of the room in her high-vis vest and steel-toed boots, gasped. She had spent 5 years being passed over by men like Julian despite saving the company millions in routing efficiency. Asha knows this business from the floor up, I said. She starts today. The board members looked at the audit binders, then at Deborah Marsh, and finally at me. One by one, hands went up around the table in unanimous agreement. Asha wiped a quiet tear from her cheek and gave me a firm, resolute nod. The meeting adjourned. The board members filed out in hushed tones, leaving only Mark and me in the vast, empty boardroom. Mark sat frozen in his chair. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of awe, shame, and complete devastation. The man who had laughed at me under the Marriott chandeliers 48 hours ago could not even find his breath to speak. I smoothed my ivory blazer, picked up my leather portfolio, and walked toward the exit. My work in this room was done. The late afternoon sun poured through the arched windows of our Bronzeville living room, painting the hardwood floors in long streaks of amber and rust. The house smelled of faded jasmine polish, coal dust, and rain. Mark sat on the sofa, his shoulders slouched, his head buried in his hands. The sharp suit he had worn to the boardroom was rumpled. His tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. He looked smaller, stripped of his corporate armor. I stood near the cold fireplace, holding a leather binder. The silence between us was no longer the heavy wall he used to build. It was raw, cracked open by the morning's collapse. Mark looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, shining with tears. He slid off the sofa and dropped to his knees on the rug before me. His shaking hands grasped at the hem of my trousers. "Elena, please," Mark choked out, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Look at me. I was wrong. I was so blind. Julian lied to me. I let my pride ruin everything. But why? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep all of this in the dark?" I looked down at him. I did not pull away, nor did I lean in. I felt a quiet ache in my chest, not the sting of anger, but the cold weight of grief. I gently unclasped his fingers from my clothing, pulling my hands back. "I did not keep secrets to play games, Mark," I said. My voice was quiet and clear. I kept my head down because I believed in building quietly. For 9 years, I managed this house. I paid our bills and made sure you never felt financial hardship. I opened the binder and pulled out a yellowed hospital receipt, placing it on the glass coffee table. 3 years ago, when your mother needed emergency cardiac surgery, the bills totaled $30,000. I continued. You thought insurance covered it. It did not. I paid that bill in full from my consulting fees. I never asked for a thank you. Mark stared at the paper, his lips parting in shock. I gave you unconditional support, I said, looking into his eyes. And what did you give me in return? 9 years of cold violence. You withdrew into silence whenever your ego felt bruised. You ignored my presence at the dinner table. You treated my job as an accountant like an embarrassing flaw. Your silence was a weapon, Mark. And at that banquet, you used your laughter to twist the knife. A soft sob sounded from the arched doorway. Mrs. Evelyn Miller stood there, leaning heavily on her wooden cane. Her wrinkled hands trembled against her cardigan. She had come through the door unnoticed. Tears tracked down the deep lines of her face. "Elena," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. She looked at the receipt, then at her kneeling son. "All these years, I listened to Julian's gossip. I pushed Mark to want a woman with a big title. I looked down on you because you didn't boast, and you saved my life. Evelyn covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with silent weeping. I picked up my laptop from the armchair and opened the screen. The blue light cut through the amber dusk. I turned the monitor toward Mark. "Look at this screen, Mark," I said. Mark leaned forward from his knees, squinting through his tears. On the screen was a drafted SEC whistleblower submission, detailed with forensic attachments. "Last night, after you laughed at me in that ballroom, I stood over this keyboard," I said, my voice steady. "If I had pressed send before midnight, that file would have hit federal prosecutors by dawn. It would have destroyed Hawthorne Logistics and dragged your name through the mud as an accomplice. You would have been ruined." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry as he stared at the red, canceled stamp across the form. "Why didn't you send it?" Mark whispered, tears dripping onto the rug. "I humiliated you. I deserved it, because I am not driven by vengeance," I replied, closing the laptop lid with a soft snap. "I canceled the transmission because I respect the 9 years we spent together. I chose to protect your freedom and career as my final act of grace. I am destroying the weapon, Mark, not for your pride, but for my own peace." Mark buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly, his body trembling with regret. Evelyn sat on the entryway bench, crying quietly into her handkerchief. I walked up the stairs to our bedroom. I picked up the small leather suitcase I had packed earlier. Beside the lamp on the nightstand, I laid down a single white envelope containing a formal petition for legal separation. I walked back down the stairs. The rhythmic thud of my suitcase against the steps sounded like the final beats of an old chapter. I stopped near the front door. Mark scrambled up from the floor, his face pale, reaching out toward me. "Elena, please don't go," Mark pleaded, his voice raw. "We can fix this. I'll change." "You cannot fix 9 years of silence in 9 minutes, Mark," I said, holding his gaze without anger. "In this envelope is a legal separation agreement. On the back, I listed contact information for a marriage therapist. Do not call me to apologize. If you want to change, do it for yourself. Learn how to be a man who does not need to shrink his wife to feel tall." I opened the heavy oak front door. The cool evening air of Chicago rushed in, smelling of autumn leaves and rain. I stepped onto the porch, pulling my blazer tight against the breeze. Behind me, the door slowly clicked shut, leaving the crying behind. I walked down the stone steps toward my car, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, clean, sharp, and free. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment in West Loop, painting the polished white walls in bright, warm gold. The air smelled of fresh eucalyptus leaves, freshly ground espresso, and clean cotton linen. 3 months had passed since I walked out the heavy oak door of the Bronzeville brownstone. I no longer spent my mornings staring at a distant, silent husband across a cold kitchen table, wondering what I had done wrong to deserve his cold shoulder. I had completely shed the skin of a helpless victim. I stopped asking why my marriage had collapsed or why Mark had chosen laughter over loyalty at that banquet table. Instead, I took total ownership of my life, my choices, my career, and my future happiness. My mindset had undergone a radical shift. I recognized that my worth was never defined by Mark's validation, his corporate title, or his family's conditional approval. I stopped blaming the past, and I stopped waiting for an apology to heal my spirit. I stepped fully into my own strength, taking complete responsibility for every step I took moving forward. Every morning began with deliberate purpose and physical discipline. At 6 o'clock, I walked along the river path, watching the sky turn soft pink over Lake Michigan, feeling the cool morning wind against my skin. I invested deeply in myself, inside and out. I updated my wardrobe with tailored silk blouses, sharp wool trousers, and structured blazers that reflected my true professional authority. I joined an executive wellness club, nourishing my body with fresh food, weight training, and daily mindfulness practice. I took absolute control of my personal finances, expanding Vance Advisory LLC from a quiet side project into a premier boutique financial consulting firm in downtown Chicago. My glass desk in West Loop was covered with new client contracts. I advised rapidly growing logistics and retail businesses across Illinois, helping founders restructure debt, clean up internal ledgers, and scale operations smoothly. I was no longer a quiet accountant hiding in the shadows of a regional grocery chain. I was a sought-after strategist, respected for my sharp analytical mind, absolute discretion, and unwavering integrity. Meanwhile, Mark was undergoing his own quiet, painful transformation. The collapse of his corporate standing and the loss of his marriage had shattered his illusions. To his credit, he did not sink into self-pity, nor did he lash out in bitter anger. The harsh reality of his own actions forced him to face the mirror honestly. Mark resigned from his high-ranking position at Hawthorne Logistics. He voluntarily took a junior sales role at a small regional logistics branch out in Naperville, determined to rebuild his career from the ground up through honest work rather than political maneuverings or golf course friendships. He moved out of our brownstone and into a modest one-bedroom apartment, stripping away the luxury cars and expensive suits he had used to mask his deep self-doubt. Every Tuesday evening, Mark walked into a clinic in downtown Chicago for sessions with a licensed marriage and emotional intelligence therapist. He learned to unpack the toxic, silent treatment he had used as a shield since childhood. He began addressing the deep-seated insecurities that had led him to shrink my presence just to feed his own fragile ego. Mark did not bombard me with frantic phone calls, desperate text messages, or grand public gestures. He respected the firm, legal boundary I had drawn with my petition for separation. Once a month, he sent a single handwritten letter to my office address, keeping his words quiet and respectful. His latest letter arrived on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. The heavy ivory envelope smelled faintly of cedar wood and crisp paper. I opened it with a silver letter opener and read his neat, deliberate cursive script. Elena, I am learning to listen. I am learning how to hold space for my own shortcomings without hiding behind a wall of silence or defensive pride. My therapist helped me realize how severely my coldness wounded our home, and how my silence was just cowardice dressed up as strength. I am doing this difficult internal work, not as a bargaining chip to force your return, but because I refuse to remain the weak man who hurt the woman he loved. I hope your days are filled with the deep peace you have always deserved. I set the letter down on my polished wooden desk. I felt no sting of bitterness, nor did I feel a sudden surge of sorrow. The burning anger that had scorched my chest for months had completely dissolved into the quiet air, leaving behind a deep, unwavering calm. I picked up my fountain pen and wrote a brief, polite reply on my firm's stationery, thanking him for his honesty, acknowledging his personal growth, and wishing him continued strength on his journey of self-improvement. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the bustling streets of Chicago. Cars moved in steady streams below, their windshields catching the bright afternoon light. The city was alive, constantly moving forward, and so was I. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back at me had clear, vibrant eyes, a posture of natural grace, and a serene smile. I had broken free from the cage of silent expectations and conditional love. I was completely independent, emotionally secure, and ready for whatever the future held. The golden hour sun hung low over the western horizon, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of fiery copper, amber, and deep violet. A gentle summer breeze blew off Lake Michigan, carrying the crisp, clean scent of fresh water and blooming marigolds. We gathered at an open-air pavilion in Lincoln Park, celebrating the one-year anniversary of Hawthorne Logistics' successful corporate restructuring. The atmosphere was light, vibrant, and filled with genuine laughter. Crystal glasses clinked softly under strings of warm, fairy lights that glowed like fallen stars against the twilight sky. I stood near the edge of the stone terrace, wearing a tailored mustard-yellow silk dress that caught the warm evening light. My dark hair fell loosely over my shoulders, and my posture was relaxed, grounded, and free. I felt no need to hide in doorways, nor did I feel the need to prove my place to anyone in the room. Asha Moore walked toward me, her eyes shining with warmth. She wore a sharp navy blazer, looking every bit the capable chief executive officer she had become over the past 12 months. Under her leadership, Hawthorne had cleared out every corrupt vendor contract, expanded its warehouse workforce, and increased employee retention by 40%. Asha stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, heartfelt hug. I would not be standing here today if you had not seen my worth when everyone else looked past me, Elena. Asha said softly, her voice filled with deep, quiet gratitude. You changed my life. You earned every bit of this, Asha, I replied, squeezing her hand. You did the work. As Asha turned to greet a group of warehouse supervisors, I looked around the terrace. The board members, logistics coordinators, and senior drivers nodded at me with genuine respect. It was not the fearful deference paid to a harsh boss, but the quiet honor given to a leader who had acted with fairness, wisdom, and absolute integrity. A familiar figure stepped out from the main hall onto the stone patio. It was Mark. He wore a simple navy suit without a tie, his shirt collar open. Over the past year, the sharp defensive edge in his posture had melted away completely. His face looked leaner, his eyes clear and calm. He had spent 12 months doing the hard, unglamorous work of self-examination in therapy, working diligently at his sales job in Naperville, without complaint. Mark walked toward me, his steps steady and unhurried. He did not approach with needy desperation, nor did he look away in shame. He stood 2 feet away, meeting my gaze with quiet maturity. Hello, Elena, Mark said. His voice was soft, carrying a steady warmth. Hello, Mark, I replied, offering a gentle nod. Mark looked out toward the lake, where the water reflected the golden light of the setting sun, before turning back to me. I wanted to thank you, Mark said quietly, not just for protecting my freedom a year ago, but for having the courage to walk away when I gave you silence. You taught me the hardest, most necessary lesson of my life. I had to lose the marriage to realize what kind of man I was becoming. I listened quietly, feeling the cool breeze move through the trees beside us. I am not asking you to start over, Elena, Mark continued, his voice steady and sincere. I know some doors close so that better ones can open, but I wanted you to know that I am learning. I am learning how to be honest with myself, how to listen, and how to stand on my own feet without using pride as a crutch. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and felt the final lingering embers of past pain dissolve into the cool evening air. I am glad to hear that, Mark, I said, a peaceful, genuine smile touching my lips. I am not angry with you anymore. We both suffered, and we both grew from those wounds. I wish you nothing but true peace. Mark smiled, a look of profound relief softening his face. He bowed his head slightly in gratitude, turned, and walked back toward the pavilion to join his colleagues. There were no tears, no dramatic arguments, and no lingering regrets. Just 2 people who had once been lost in the dark, now standing cleanly in the light of truth. I turned away from the crowd and stepped up to the stone railing at the edge of the terrace, looking directly out over Lake Michigan. The sun touched the water, spreading a brilliant path of liquid gold across the ripples. The cool air filled my lungs, fresh and crisp, carrying the sweet scent of summer earth and open water. I leaned against the stone balustrade and took a long, deep breath. A profound sense of freedom washed over me, settling deep into my bones. I realized then that the true worth of a woman was never measured by the title on her business card, the material wealth in her bank account, or the seat a man offered her at a dinner table. Her true worth lived in her own quiet spirit. It lived in her capacity to endure cold silence without losing her warmth, her courage to protect herself when the storm raged, and her wisdom to walk away with dignity intact. Marriages may fracture, corporate empires may rise and fall, and human promises may break in the dark. But a woman who knows her own value, who takes full responsibility for her own happiness, will always find her footing. I raised my face to the fading sky, feeling the last golden rays of sunlight warm my skin. I smiled, completely free, standing tall in my own light. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below so we know we're walking this journey together. Hope to see you on the next page.